Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of the Endrey podcast. I'm really glad to have you here. I think that today should be a cracker. It's a topic that I've been wanting to dig into for a while, and I keep putting it to my patrons, but they don't vote for it. But then I realized, hang on a sec, who's running the show here? Me or you? It's mostly you, but now and then I'll indulge, and that's what today is. The topic, surprisingly horrible things that the US has done. I started listing things that I knew about and doing a little bit of research into the topic, but it immediately became apparent that this isn't just an episode, this is a series. So I hope that you enjoy today's episode and are prepared for a lot more, because there is, unsurprisingly, I'm not sure, but there's a lot of dirt and there's a lot of fun stuff to muck through. And the reason I think it's a compelling topic for me to dig into is because as the cultural hegemon, we get a lot of information about what the West and the US specifically does right. And rightly so. There's a lot of important stuff there that only occurs in that society. But we learn less of the bad things in our histories and in our stories and our collective narratives than we wind up knowing from either societies that we have totally repudiated, like Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia, or from those who just aren't around to defend themselves in the same way or to continuously represent the good side of their society. So there's a lot to dig into. And the reason I'm particularly compelled by looking at the ones that I think will surprise you is because I feel like we're aware of the sort of major turning points of horrible things that have happened in US history: slavery, segregation. And then even then, I feel like most of my listeners will be across things like MK Ultra and some of the more horrible CIA experiments. So I anticipate at some stage I'll come around to looking at the states that the CIA has overthrown, particularly democratically elected ones. But once the collective decides that something's bad, we sort of end up with a kind of evil valence over whatever noun it is that we attach to it. Like instantly, the idea of slavery brings up an emotional response. But it's often the case that there's a kind of mundanity to the worst elements of what human societies are capable of. And that same icky feeling that we get in hearing about slavery doesn't come up when we hear the word Harvard University, for example. And I think it's really important to unpack that, because it's quite likely that the word Harvard instead invokes ideas of prestige and leadership and the elite and the advancement of society. But I think it's really important to know exactly what governments, eminent intellectuals, academic institutions, philanthropists, organizations of repute, and other such figures that we give authority to, we need to know what they're capable of. And by doing a little tour of how some horrors actually occur, I think we can get a better idea for how they can just creep in at the sides. As I talk about a lot, many of the most major decisions that occur in our quote unquote democracies occur without any election at all and occur without the majority of public approval. Though, of course, legitimizing certain things with elections and public approval helps to enable them more. They're not prerequisites to the worst stuff from happening. So despite looking at the US in this one, there's any number of societies you could be looking at. This is certainly not an anti-American series. I actually quite like America and really admire the society for a whole host of reasons. This is instead an opportunity, and I guess I'm instead hoping that this episode and this series is an invitation and a reminder of the importance to interrogate beyond what things seem to be and to work always to understand what they are, where that's possible. Before we do get into it, I want to say thanks, as always, to my patrons. I appreciate you more than you could ever know. None of this would exist without you, and I'm so grateful for that I've even been thinking about doing an episode on encouragement to illustrate how powerful that can be. If you are interested in having a say on upcoming episodes or supporting the show generally, please head over to patreon.com/Endrey, Endrey. There's a bunch of tiers, including a free tier, which allows you to vote on what we'll be looking at. And it's no exaggeration to say that I wouldn't be able to feed my family without those of you who are able to financially contribute. So thank you from my chubby children. So let's get stuck in. Surprisingly horrible things that the US has done. Part 1, Eugenics. There's a famous study that the US Public Health Service started in 1932. entitled The Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male. It was conducted by the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention upon nearly 400 African-American men with syphilis and a control group of another couple hundred to determine the effects of the disease syphilis when untreated to the point of death and autopsy. The 600 subjects were impoverished African-American sharecroppers from Alabama, and as an incentive for them to participate in the study, the men were promised free medical care and promised funeral expenses. The men were all initially told that the study would last for 6 months, but it ended up lasting for 40 years, went between 1932 and 1972. And in that period, they didn't tell any of the men that they had syphilis. Not only that, but they also didn't administer penicillin, which was a well-known effective treatment for the condition at the time. And instead, initially, some patients were administered arsenic, bismuth, and mercury. But as it became clear that the study wasn't yielding any useful data, instead they just decided to follow the subjects until their deaths and halted any treatment. Of the 400, it's estimated that more than 100 died of tertiary syphilis, during which period also 40 of the patients' wives were infected with syphilis and 19 children were born with congenital syphilis. Again, this is in a period where there's a clearly known cure. The program only finally came to an end in 1972 when its unethical methods were exposed by a journalist, and that led to a class action against the federal government, which was settled out of court for $10 million. It took another 20-something years until US President Bill Clinton acknowledged and issued a formal apology for the study. So in this instance, we've got the health department of the federal government intentionally selecting a group of its own citizens by race and by class, and conducting medical controls of them that have effectively resulted in at least a quarter of their deaths. What's more, it wasn't uncovered as part of some road to Damascus moment where the government reviewed all of its programs. It was uncovered by a journalist and settled out of court. Which leads to the obvious question, how widespread is this stuff? How likely is it that your government is trying to kill you at a given time? This study and story is sort of reasonably well known because it did eventually come to light and there was time for it in the public sphere. And I imagine, or certainly hope, that it's a shocking story from modern sensibilities, the idea that that could happen. Surely it could never happen again. But it turns out that this type of very callous indifference to the well-being of a state's own citizens is extremely common to the US from this period, and not just across racial lines. I didn't understand the context of the eugenics movement that occurred within that society from the start of the 20th century. Something like this ends up being just another pixel in the image, and I'm sad to say, not really surprising at all. Somehow I feel for most of us now, when we talk about eugenics, the image that comes straight to mind is evil German doctors and Nazism and something that's very much in the past and culturally divorced from how we live today. But you might be interested to learn that the idea had its genesis in British society and quickly gained a strong foothold in America. It also doesn't start out with any of the obvious hyper evil, sinister overlay that it sort of gets as its flavor at the end. Which is, I think, something really important to remember as we go across a bit of a history of it today. In fact, it's a pretty understandable genesis. The initial concern is, in the era where humanity is starting to understand evolution and genetics, it's not surprising that people would start to think, oh goodness, if intelligent people procreate with intelligent people, are their children more likely to be intelligent? And then to think, well, perhaps if unintelligent people have children with unintelligent people, are their children more likely to be unintelligent? And then the step shift goes to concerns about morality, if amoral people have children with amoral people, et cetera, et cetera. And then from any of this, it's a quick step shift to think, well, how can we build the best society possible or make sure that we're getting the best that we can out of people? And there, if it wasn't murky already, it starts to take on the sinister pall. But again, I would say that this is only in retrospect that it feels that way, because culturally at the time, the idea of selectively breeding humans to ensure that society was everything that you might ideally want it to be was very routine, was very normal, and took a foothold across any number of eminent public figures and institutions that you could care to name. Not just that, it was also initially not really pushed back against, whilst there will always be people that will not like anything. Eugenics institutes ended up being set up everywhere, and publishing a book advocating eugenics wasn't the type of thing that would harm your career. In fact, the opposite in many instances. And it's an idea, as I slated, that takes a foothold in American intelligentsia and academia. I'm reading now from a 1912 speech by Harvard President Emeritus Charles William Eliot, who addressed the Harvard Club of San Francisco on a subject close to his heart, racial purity. Each nation should keep its stock pure. There should be no blending of races. So he's warning against mixing races, which for him included Irish Catholics marrying white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and Jews marrying Gentiles. Of course, also blacks marrying whites. And this was a central tenet of eugenics. Again, at the center of it is the ideal of human progress and the idea that the best way to advance the species is to make sure that reproduction is occurring between the best people in the best combinations. The dark side of which, of course, is preventing the unworthy people from having children, which is another issue that this Harvard president was outspoken in advocating, to the degree at which, and he wasn't alone in this, quoting him, the forced sterilization of people considered to be feeble-minded, physically disabled, criminalistic, or otherwise flawed, which includes moral flaws. And the backdrop of this is a society. It's one thing for these ideas to exist as curiosities in conversations, but these ideas went from that reputable foothold to be enacted in legislation and programs within the US very quickly. In fact, the context in which he's giving that speech, it's already been 5 years since Indiana had enacted the nation's first eugenic sterilization law, which by this time Eliot's celebrating as having blazed the trail which all free states must follow if they would protect themselves from moral degeneracy. Just the previous year in 1911, the Carnegie Institute issued a report exploring 18 methods for removing defective genetic attributes. The 8th method that they slated was euthanasia. The most commonly suggested method of this euthanasia was to set up everywhere local gas chambers. Does that sound familiar? This is 1911 in America we're talking about. Perhaps unsurprisingly, many in the eugenics movement didn't think that setting up local gas chambers everywhere was something that Americans were ready for at a large scale. So many doctors came up with other ways of subtly implementing this eugenics agenda through their practices. In some instances, this just involved lethal neglect, but one of the more egregious ones was there was a mental institution in Lincoln, Illinois, which fed its patients milk from cows that had tuberculosis, so the milk had tuberculosis, with the reasoning that if people were genetically fit, then they would be resistant to the tuberculosis and not die. In the years that they practiced this, 30 to 40% of the people drinking that milk did die. Aside from the outright, I guess what we would consider to be murder today, the preferred method for managing undesirables, again, maybe unsurprisingly, euthanasia generally didn't see that much support from people in the US at the time. This motivated the enthusiastic eugenicists to turn to sterilization and forced segregation, all with the goal of keeping the unfit from reproducing. And again, this is not out of a conscious hatred for the unfit. This is mostly out of what we now would consider to be a very misguided idea of constructing an ideal society full of really capable and morally pure people and free of the diseases that they were hoping to eradicate with these methods. So from the first eugenic sterilization law in Indiana that I mentioned in 1907, between then and 1963, at least 64,000 people were forcibly sterilized under eugenic legislation in the United States. The reasons that this happened were different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and from time to time, but broadly, men were sterilized to treat aggression, to eliminate their criminal behavior from the gene pool, while women were sterilized to control their sexuality. This also included sterilizations to quote-unquote protect white racial health. These ideas of taking such extreme methods to protect racial purity and moral virtue, etc., they're ones today that we completely associate with Nazi Germany, but these didn't occur in isolation of a social license. They were pretty well supported. A 1937 Fortune magazine poll found that 2/3 of respondents supported eugenic sterilization of mental defectives. 63% supported sterilization of criminals, and only 15% of people opposed both. It might be easy to imagine with the contemporary lens that this stuff is being advocated by the harshest, most racist, conservative-minded people, but it's actually kind of the forefront of progressive thinking at the time. And maybe surprisingly, California is at the forefront of it and conducted around 20,000 of the 60-something thousand sterilizations that occurred. It was a reasonably shared goal of the leaders of the eugenics movement to sterilize some 10% of the American population at the time, so it's millions and millions of people. An excellent work looking into this has been done by American historian Edwin Black, who wrote a book in 2003 called War Against the Weak. And I'm going to read from him here. Eugenics would have been so much bizarre parlor talk had it not been for extensive financing by corporate philanthropies, specifically the Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Harriman Railroad fortune. They were all in league with some of America's most respected scientists from such prestigious universities as Stanford, Yale, Harvard, and Princeton. These academicians espoused race theory and race science and then faked and twisted data to serve eugenics' racist aims. Stanford President David Starr Jordan originated the notion of race and blood in his 1902 racial epistle, Blood of a Nation, in which the university scholar declared that human qualities and conditions such as talent and poverty were passed through the blood. In 1904, the Carnegie Institution established a laboratory complex at Cold Spring Harbor on Long Island that stockpiled millions of index cards on ordinary Americans as researchers carefully plotted the removal of families, bloodlines, and whole peoples. From Cold Spring Harbor, eugenics advocates agitated in the legislatures of America, as well as the nation's social services agencies and associations. The Harriman Railroad fortune paid local charities, such as the New York Bureau of Industries and Immigration, to seek out Jewish, Italian, and other immigrants in New York and other crowded cities and subject them to deportation, confinement, or forced sterilization. The Rockefeller Foundation helped found the German eugenics program and even funded the program that Joseph Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz. Much of the spiritual guidance and political agitation for the American eugenics movement came from California's quasi-autonomous eugenics societies such as Pasadena's Human Betterment Foundation and the California branch of the American Eugenics Society, which coordinated much of their activity with the Eugenics Research Society in Long Island. These organizations, which functioned as part of a closely knit network, published racist eugenic newsletters in pseudoscientific journals such as Eugenics News and propagandized for the Nazis. So the Rockefeller Foundation helped found the German eugenics program and even funded the program that Joseph Mengele worked in before he went to Auschwitz. I think that these connections are so important to make because, well, one, because they're there, but two, it's so easy to forget in the aesthetic of what evil eugenicists are. And when we create these cartoon depictions of what undesirable behavior and outcomes and thinking is, we deny the capacity that we have for it in our own societies, in our own aesthetics, and also deny the responsibility that we collectively share for these actions. Edwin Black's War Against the Weak is really great in particular for drawing that line between these American early eugenics programs and their outgrowth into the Nazi programs and what they become. Obviously, the ideas take root in a whole different way in Nazi Germany, particularly under the circumstances of total war, which inevitably are going to ramp up elements of society in ways that you couldn't predict. But it's notable that one of Hitler's first acts when he did take control in 1933, he passed the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. And when they proposed their own sterilization program, they specifically noted the success of sterilization laws in California as inspiration. And the American eugenicists saw this stuff with great excitement. They thought it was the ultimate fulfillment of their own research efforts. The following year, by 1934, Germany's sterilizations were going at about 5,000 a month. And the California eugenics leader, M. Goethe, returned from Germany, and he bragged to a colleague, so quote, "You'll be interested to know that your works has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler in this epoch-making program. Everywhere I sensed that their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought. I want you, my dear friend, to carry this thought with you for the rest of your life, that you have really jolted into action a great government of 60 million people." Which is that same year, which is 10 years after Virginia had passed its own sterilization act, the superintendent of Virginia's Western State Hospital published a lamentation saying, "The Germans are beating us at our own game." So there really is a much stronger link there than I think is collectively in our imagination. The crazy thing is these connections aren't just limited to sharing of ideas and directly funding stuff. Because I mentioned before the social segregation, like that manifests not only in the racial segregation laws that we all know about from the US South, but also in immigration policies, which once these ideas start to take hold, you see a huge drop off in the 20s of the amount of Jewish and Italian people who are allowed to come into the US, for instance. There's an immigration act that's passed in 1924, and Jewish immigration to the US from Europe goes from 190,000 in 1920 to just 7,000 in 1926. By the time World War II is raging, these racially based prejudices come with consequence back in the US as well. I'm reading from a 2016 edition of Harvard Magazine here. A few years ago, correspondence was discovered from 1941 in which Otto Frank pleaded with the US State Department for visas for himself, his wife, and his daughters, Margot and Anne. It is understood today that Anne Frank died because Nazis considered her a member of an inferior race. But few appreciate that her death was also due, in part, to the fact that many in the US Congress felt the same way. One really astonishing thing I learned when looking into this is that the idea of a blonde, blue-eyed, Northern European Nordic type being the master race is something that doesn't come from Hitler. It's obviously popularly linked to the Nazis now, but it's an idea that comes from the United States. and very specifically with the intention to populate the earth with vastly more of this biological elite and less or even none of anybody else. That Carnegie-supported publication that I mentioned earlier that advocated the use of gas chambers, the full title of it is The Preliminary Report of the Committee of the Eugenics Section of the American Breeders' Association to Study and to Report on the Best Practical Means for Cutting Off the Defective Germplasm in the Human Population. It's hard to believe from today's culture that title could be proposed and taken seriously. Just the end bit again. The American Breeders' Association to study and to report on the best practical means for cutting off the defective germplasm in the human population. It's incredible. So as always, it's very easy to get lost in statistics and to lose the individuality of this stuff. But I feel like if you knew just one instance where the US government had intentionally sterilized somebody to make sure that they didn't breed because of the immutable characteristics of who they are, you would be shocked. We saw what the killing of George Floyd by the police officer stirred up in society. Here we're talking at 60,000 people done over decades. And I suppose because it's done in a different cultural context and across a period of time, it largely goes unremarked upon today. But I hope you agree with me that this stuff is worth revisiting. I'll try to circumvent that statistics blindness for us by just giving the story of one woman who was sterilized in this period. And I should say more women are sterilized than men because women have the responsibility of carrying future children. They're seen as being more responsible also for the quality of the people that come out, absurdly. And in fact, in California, it is mostly women that are being sterilized. And not just for obvious racist reasons. Also, many of them are classified as bad girls. You know, they're getting diagnoses like being passionate or oversexed or sexually wayward. And that's considered to be enough to issue these forced sterilizations. Like this stuff isn't bad enough, there are always going to be horrific excesses. And at one place, the Sonoma State Home, some women were sterilized because they were deemed to have an abnormally large clitoris or labia. And this is all in institutions that are still running today. Anyway, onto the specific example. Just a warning, this is a horrible story. If this whole episode hasn't put you up to date, this is another horrible story in its specifics. And it comes from the sort of high watermark of when the eugenics is occurring in the late 20s. Where the Supreme Court is hearing a challenge to Virginia's eugenic sterilization law. The case surrounds a young woman, Carrie Buck, who'd been designated as feeble-minded by the state and selected for eugenic sterilization. So Carrie grew up impoverished in Charlottesville, taken in by a foster family and then raped by one of its relatives. She got the diagnosis of feeble-minded because she fell pregnant out of wedlock. And because she had received the diagnosis of feeble-minded, she was selected for sterilization. In another moment of glory to the US Supreme Court, they voted 8-1 to uphold the Virginia law and her sterilization. And that cleared the path for sterilizations to continue across the country for subsequent decades. And this is a real window into the horrific mainstream. I mean, 8-1, it already indicates how mainstream it is. But they have to write the reason for their judgments here. And the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, "It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." That 3 generations refers to her mother and her daughter. Goes on to say that it's necessary to sterilize people who sap the strength of the state in order to prevent being swamped with incompetence. So poor Carrie Buck ends up losing her daughter to illness and died childless in 1983, not that long ago. And she didn't understand until her final years what the state had actually done to her or why she'd been unable to have more children. I think that it's more than just interesting. I think it's a responsibility for us to remember situations like Carrie Buck and the 60,000 other unnamed others who experienced this forced sterilization. Not to mention the people that were outright killed through neglect or through mistreatment by their government in this time in America, because it really wards off the hubris that we are incapable of such things. Because I think it's clear that there's a tendency to, once something has been defeated historically, to package it as an extreme outlier of a particular aesthetic that has been defeated and then to keep it in that box. Whereas I hope it's pretty clear from this little journey today that hubris, that confidence that we in our societies are superior to this stuff is unearned and perhaps the very dangerous tree to plant that provides the shade for this stuff to happen. Because a reminder, it wasn't everybody that supported this. It wasn't something that was necessarily brought to ballot boxes or anything, but it did occur under everybody's watch. And I also don't think that we should pretend that we're past this, even knowing this fable, because the reason this was such an infectious truth for so many people at the time is because there are genetic traits that are transferred. That's a reality. And we do all contest different ideas for how we want society to be or how we think it should be. And whilst eugenics itself as a title has become less popular, you can certainly find people carrying the torch for all of these ideas today, albeit with social consequences. But it's not something that I think that we should assume is only the domain of bad people or other people. Genetic testing itself is very common during pregnancies, and in the instances where conditions like Down syndrome are identified, it is a majority of people that terminate their pregnancies. In societies like the UK or Iceland, it's 90 or closer to 100%. And this is all despite the fact that people with Down syndrome can live perfectly independent and active lives well into their senior years. Now, I'm not taking a moral position on what you should think about this, nor do I necessarily have one. I just think that it's really worth facing these hard questions directly because they're only going to keep knocking at the door as we exponentially seem to be entering the realm with CRISPR and things like that of having the capacity to edit the people that do and don't live in our society. It's not just a good versus evil aesthetic, and there are real lines to be drawn and considerations to be made collectively. Not to mention that the softer but very real regulations and restrictions that exist that lead to conditions where certain people can't access quality living, which may lead to the loss of their fertility or may not have the economic means to do the reproduction that they would like. I mean, there are various things that we accept because there's a kind of negative space where we don't have to do anything for those realities to exist compared to the far more obvious interventions of state sterilisations. But ultimately, I think it's just worth facing the reality that this is something that a state that at that time and now still out loud says that it is the land of freedom and the land of liberty. This is something that they did to their own people, and there's many more examples of horrors that they've committed to their own people, let alone those to others, that if there's sufficient interest, I'll keep looking at as a series. But I only have so much time to ear bash you with all this stuff today. I hope you did enjoy it and it wasn't too heavy. Or actually, I don't hope that it wasn't too heavy because it is heavy, but I hope that you'll forgive me presenting it as a reality because I'm not doing it out of some gonzo attention-grabbing gambit. I just think that it is really important to reflect upon what we are all capable of so that we can keep vigilant in things that sound good. Like, some of these institutions, they have names like Institution for the Betterment of Humanity or Department of Health or Yale University or whatever it might be. And it's worth making sure that we don't fall into the traps of their authority and that we keep digging to see what the substance of things truly is behind what they may be called, and to realize that whilst we may have different physical reactions where we hear the name Heinrich Himmler to the name J.D. Rockefeller, often the consequences of actions are a result of circumstance rather than intent. Thank you so much for listening, and another final thanks to my patrons. I appreciate you so much. Okay, I think I'm going to take a walk to clear off this grime. Hope that you're somewhere safe. Have a wonderful day.